No matter how much Janet Jackson has tried to put this chapter behind her, the rumors refuse to fade. For decades, whispers have lingered about a supposed child she allegedly had with James DeBarge, and they've only grown louder with time. People who claim to have been close to them, along with longtime fans who followed Janet closely during the 1980s, insist they either witnessed signs of a pregnancy or heard convincing accounts that she gave birth to a baby girl. Fueling the speculation even more, members of the DeBarge family, including James himself, have repeatedly maintained that a child does exist and that Janet worked tirelessly to keep them at a distance. For years, those claims were dismissed as bitterness or fantasy. But now, according to recent allegations, James may have finally made contact with the daughter he's been searching for all along, suggesting that what once sounded unbelievable might not have been imagined after all. And to be clear, this isn't a new storyline. For as long as people can remember, James DeBarge, his relatives, and observers from Janet's early career have echoed the same idea: there's a secret daughter Janet never wanted the public to know about. Eventually, Janet felt compelled to respond. She publicly stated that she would never be the kind of person to deny a child access to their father and called the idea completely absurd. But here's where things get interesting. While she rejected the accusation of keeping a child hidden, she never explicitly said, "There is no child." Not once. Instead, she carefully navigated the conversation, relying on years of media training to sidestep a direct denial. That silence has raised eyebrows. If there truly was no child, why not shut the rumor down once and for all? And if there was a child, what reason would Janet have for keeping such a secret? According to those who believe the story, the answer lies in the storm surrounding her life at the time: a volatile relationship with James, the heavy influence of a controlling and toxic father, and the personal battles James himself was fighting during that period. In that chaos, secrecy may not have been about denial, it may have been about survival. The child was allegedly born during one of the most turbulent chapters of Janet's early life. When Janet and James first crossed paths in 1982, she was already stepping into stardom, young, talented, and carrying the weight of the iconic Jackson name. Audiences knew her from television hits like Good Times and Different Strokes, and the industry was clearly grooming her for something bigger. James, meanwhile, was riding the wave of success with the DeBarge family band, a Motown powerhouse responsible for unforgettable tracks like Rhythm of the Night, All This Love, and I Like It. They were both young, famous, and surrounded by Hollywood energy, and when their worlds collided, the connection was instant. But while the romance felt magical to them, it was anything but to Joe Jackson. According to insiders close to the family, Joe didn't see James as a harmless love interest, he saw him as a liability. James's struggle with drug addiction raised serious red flags, and Joe feared the relationship could not only derail Janet's rising career but also tarnish the carefully guarded Jackson brand. Still, in 1984, Janet made a bold and deeply personal choice. She ran away and married James. The DeBarge family welcomed her warmly, so much so that James's uncle officiated the ceremony. But once Joe found out, the situation exploded. Allegedly, his reaction was swift and vicious. He is said to have threatened to cut Janet off entirely unless she ended the marriage. And this wasn't just an angry father speaking, this was a controlling manager desperate to protect an image and a legacy at all costs. At the time, Janet was only 18 years old. James was 21. Joe's fury wasn't rooted solely in parental concern, it was fueled by his obsession with control, reputation, and power over Janet's career. That dynamic would later become one of the reasons Janet chose to distance herself from him as she grew older and reclaimed her independence. It was also during this period that rumors of a pregnancy began circulating. Some believe Janet married James because she was already expecting. Whether that's true or not, one thing is clear: if she was pregnant, revealing it publicly at 18 would have been unthinkable. A teenage pregnancy, especially under those circumstances, would have been seen as disastrous for the family's image. Add to that James's worsening addiction, and the situation became even more fragile. James has since spoken openly about how deeply they loved each other. He described their relationship as a tragic case of perfect timing gone wrong, right person, wrong moment. According to him, had they been older and more stable, their marriage might have survived. Janet echoed the darkness of that time in her 2022 documentary, describing a marriage that became increasingly bleak and joyless as James's addiction spiraled. Despite everything, Janet tried to be the devoted wife. She put her own ambitions on pause to support him, often prioritizing his struggles over her career. There were moments when she was called in the middle of the night to track him down, searching unfamiliar places just to make sure he was safe. When she found drugs around their home, she didn't ignore them, she hid them, or flushed them away, hoping she could somehow save him. But love, no matter how sincere, couldn't fix everything. And what unfolded during those years would leave questions. questions that, decades later, still refuse to disappear. What followed was a cycle of non-stop conflict, arguments that went far beyond ordinary couple disagreements. These weren't petty fights sparked by misunderstandings, they were heavy, draining confrontations shaped by fear, control, and pressures neither of them had the tools to manage. Fame has a way of magnifying everything. Minor tensions explode into major crises, private struggles become public fodder, and emotional pain cuts deeper when there's an audience watching your every move. Janet wasn't simply a young wife learning how to navigate marriage. She was a teenager born into one of the most scrutinized families in the world, burdened with expectations that had nothing to do with her personal happiness. James, meanwhile, was fighting his own demons, grappling with sudden success and the addictive habits that often follow it. When two people are barely staying afloat themselves, rescuing each other becomes nearly impossible. By March of 1985, just 8 months after saying "I do," Janet chose annulment. 8 months. Not years of trying, not a slow unraveling, but a swift and decisive exit. That timeline alone speaks volumes. In families where reputation is everything, an annulment is not a casual choice. This wasn't a quiet agreement reached after reflection. It was sudden, urgent, and driven by necessity. Something had gone terribly wrong, something that couldn't be fixed. And years later, people still ask the same question: what was happening behind closed doors that made her leave so quickly? If there truly was a child, or even the possibility of one, bringing that child into a world shaped by addiction, instability, and relentless fame would have been incredibly dangerous. Addiction doesn't stay contained, it bleeds into every relationship, creating chaos, emotional unpredictability, and deep instability. A child raised under those conditions, especially in the glare of global attention, would have carried a burden most adults wouldn't survive. Janet, despite her youth, may have understood that better than anyone. She had grown up witnessing firsthand how fame fractures families, distorts reality, and leaves emotional scars that last a lifetime. And context matters. The 1980s were ruthless. This was long before celebrities had social media to reclaim their narratives or speak directly to fans. Back then, tabloids controlled the story. They didn't just report events, they exaggerated them, twisted them, and often invented them altogether. Privacy was nearly non-existent, especially for someone with the last name Jackson. Paparazzi hunted relentlessly, scandals sold papers, and shock value was king. A secret child tied to the Jackson legacy would have been explosive. It would have dominated headlines, fueled endless speculation, and followed Janet for the rest of her career. Every song would have been analyzed for hidden meanings. Every interview would have carried an unspoken question. The child wouldn't have been allowed a normal existence, they would have become a mystery, a rumor, and a spectacle. Joe Jackson understood that reality better than most. Regardless of how people feel about him, he knew the entertainment machine inside and out. He knew how quickly narratives could spiral and how devastating unchecked rumors could be, especially for a young woman just beginning to build an identity separate from her famous family. If there was even a hint of a situation that could be turned into scandal, Joe would have viewed it as a direct threat to Janet's future. And it's entirely possible he moved aggressively to keep it buried. What's particularly telling is that around this time, Janet began to fade from public view. Articles from that era note how rarely she appeared, how she seemed to withdraw just as her career was gaining momentum. For an artist on the rise, that kind of disappearance is unusual. While some saw it as a break or a strategic pause, others see something more deliberate, a retreat. To believers of the hidden child theory, it doesn't look like rest. It looks like concealment. But hiding doesn't always mean wrongdoing. Sometimes it means protection. Sometimes it's about survival. Janet had spent her entire life under a microscope, constantly judged and dissected. If she needed time, whether to heal emotionally, process trauma, or protect something deeply personal, stepping away from the spotlight may have been her only option. In that era, the industry wasn't forgiving toward women who showed vulnerability. Strength was demanded. Silence was often the safest armor. It's also impossible to ignore just how young she was through all of this. Janet wasn't a seasoned star with decades of control over her image. She was still growing, still discovering who she was beyond the Jackson name. Decisions made under that kind of pressure at such a young age aren't always calculated, they're instinctive. Fear plays a powerful role. Fear of losing autonomy. Fear of harming others. Fear of being trapped in a story you never chose. And then there's the emotional weight of a marriage that ended almost as soon as it began. Even without children, annulments carry grief, disappointment, and self-blame. Now add fame, family dominance, and public scrutiny to the mix, and the burden becomes crushing. Janet didn't just leave a relationship, she did it under a global spotlight, knowing that whether she spoke or stayed silent, the world would speculate anyway. The quiet that followed only deepened the mystery. When public figures choose not to explain themselves, curiosity rushes in to fill the silence. Gaps invite imagination, and over time, unanswered questions evolve into stories that take on lives of their own. Rumors don't always disappear, they linger, waiting for the right moment to resurface, especially when people begin revisiting the past and linking moments that may never have been connected at all. What keeps this story alive is the absence of certainty. There's no hard evidence, no final confirmation, only fragments, timing, and coincidences that feel too precise for some to dismiss outright. The rapid annulment. Janet's noticeable retreat from public view. The iron-tight control surrounding her image during that era. Together, they form a vacuum where speculation naturally thrives. Still, speculation is all it has ever been. If Janet was guarding something personal, she did so successfully. Even decades later, people are still guessing instead of knowing. That alone speaks to how meticulously her life was managed, whether by her own choice or out of necessity. At a time when celebrity privacy was nearly impossible, keeping any secret would have required extraordinary discipline and complete cooperation from everyone involved. Of course, there's another possibility, that the truth is far simpler than the theories suggest. Relationships end. People burn out. Sometimes stepping away from the spotlight has nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with survival. Silence doesn't always hide secrets. Absence doesn't always signal wrongdoing. But when the name Jackson is involved, simplicity is rarely accepted at face value. What is undeniable is that this chapter changed Janet. When she returned, she did so with greater strength, independence, and creative control. Something in her had shifted. She moved forward with a clearer sense of self and a firmer grip on her artistry, as though early hardship had carved out resilience. Whatever lessons she learned, whether through love, loss, or something left unspoken, they shaped the woman she became. Perhaps that's the heart of this story. Not whether a secret existed, but how Janet navigated a world that demanded perfection while offering her little space to be human. In an era obsessed with excess, exposure, and spectacle, choosing to step back, even briefly, may have been an act of quiet courage. When she re-emerged, she was still only 18, divorced, and carrying burdens the public couldn't fully see. The explanation offered to the world was simple, almost dismissive: stress, exhaustion, relentless work, and birth control. Janet repeated it often enough that it solidified into accepted truth. She spoke of endless hours, little sleep, constant pressure to perform, to succeed, to never falter. Anyone familiar with that environment understood how brutally it could impact the body. Weight gain, she explained, was not a mystery, it was a consequence of a system that pushed young women to their limits while expecting flawless smiles. People close to her backed up that narrative. Debbie Allen, her co-star at the time, later confirmed that Janet was working non-stop, on set daily, rehearsing, filming, repeating scenes until the strain was visible. Debbie said there were no clear signs of pregnancy, no unexplained absences, no special arrangements. Janet showed up every day, pushing herself as though stopping wasn't an option. For many, that testimony closed the case. It aligned with a story that felt reasonable: a young star overwhelmed by pressure, misjudged by gossip, scrutinized by an industry that never blinked. James, however, never accepted that explanation. From the beginning, he held on to a belief that refused to fade, that he had a daughter somewhere in the world. At first, he spoke of it softly. Over time, his conviction grew stronger. People urged him to let go, to move on, to stop clinging to something that only brought him pain. But every denial seemed to deepen his certainty instead of dissolving it. For him, this was never about headlines or proving a point, it was about a child he believed existed, a truth he felt deeply and instinctively. Janet responded in different ways over the years. Sometimes she portrayed James as confused or emotionally wounded. Other times, she suggested he was unable to accept reality. And often, she said nothing at all. Silence can be a powerful form of defense. But James remained unwavering. He repeated the same message with a persistence that unsettled people: he would not stop searching for his daughter. Not now. Not later. Not ever. His family stood firmly beside him, and their support only intensified the divide. They reinforced his claims, speaking as though the child's existence was an established fact rather than a rumor. To them, it wasn't speculation, it was something known, something deliberately ignored by everyone else. What hurt most, they said, wasn't just secrecy, but exclusion. They couldn't understand why they were kept away, why they were denied contact, why an entire part of her identity had been sealed off. To them, it didn't feel like protection. It felt like being erased. As time moved on, many expected the story to fade into obscurity, but it never quite did. Instead, it lingered in the background, resurfacing every so often through quiet remarks, old interviews, and online forums where people replayed vintage clips frame by frame, convinced something important had been overlooked. Time softens walls, though, even the strongest ones. Eventually, word began to spread that Janet's position had shifted. She was no longer completely closed off to the idea of James connecting with the daughter he believed was theirs. There was only one non-negotiable condition: it had to remain private. No headlines. No interviews. No turning something deeply personal into public entertainment. For the first time, privacy came before everything else. That shift may explain why James and his family, once outspoken and emotional about the situation, suddenly went quiet. The public statements stopped. The comments disappeared. To some, that silence looked like surrender. To others, it felt intentional, the kind of quiet that comes when something fragile finally needs protection. Still, even the most carefully guarded truths have a way of leaking. The story crept back into public awareness, not with dramatic exposés, but with subtle confirmation. For many who had believed the rumor for years, it felt like validation, as if something long dismissed had quietly been proven real. That sense of validation didn't come without debate. Some argued that if a father was battling addiction and instability at the time, keeping a child away was an act of protection, not cruelty. From that perspective, distance wasn't punishment, it was safety. Others pushed back, insisting that no matter how complicated the circumstances, a child shouldn't be denied knowledge of their own roots. The arguments went in circles, fueled by partial truths and deeply personal values. At the center of it all is the child herself, now an adult, according to those familiar with the situation. She has agency. She can choose whether she wants a relationship with her father or not. And that reality brings everything into focus. After decades of speculation, commentary, and theory, the final decision belongs to one person alone. Public opinion simply doesn't outrank that. Still, memories linger, especially among those who watched events unfold in real time. Some recall seeing Janet on Fame, fully present and thriving, until suddenly she wasn't. They remember noticing changes in her body, a stomach that seemed to grow in a way that felt impossible to ignore once mentioned. Then, just as quickly, she vanished from the show. Some claim she was fired without explanation. The official reasoning was weight gain, nothing more. But for many, that explanation never quite rang true. They argued the weight appeared concentrated in one place, not spread the way stress or lifestyle changes usually show. It was a detail that stuck, refusing to fade from memory. The annulment only deepened suspicion. Rumors swirled that her father pushed hard for it, demanding a clean legal break that would erase everything on paper as well as in public perception. Those convinced she had been pregnant claimed she looked several months along before leaving the show. Their certainty didn't come from documents or official statements, but from what they believed they saw with their own eyes. And that's where the story remains. It doesn't settle neatly into truth or fiction. It exists in the gray space between denial and belief, between protection and control, between a young woman overwhelmed by pressure and a man unwilling to release the idea of his child. It's a story shaped by fame, power, fear, and silence. And like so many stories born in that world, it leaves behind more questions than answers, softened by time, but never fully erased. I remember Right On magazine announcing that Janet and James were expecting a child, and then suddenly,